The first thing you want to do is to plan your scene's details. We're going to start out planning the place where your story takes place. So in art, showing a scene has three parts: the background, the middle ground, and the foreground. These may be familiar to you from past art classes. Foreground, middle ground, and background are concepts that apply to many 2D projects. So you'll see this in landscapes and in still lifes, but if you look at right here, we're gonna just look at these landscapes right here. The foreground is toward the bottom of the paper. The middle ground is in the middle, and the background is towards the top of the paper. And what we're doing is basically creating an illusion of depth. If I scroll down here, it gives you a little bit more detail about what each one is. So the foreground of a landscape is generally closer to the bottom of the composition. It's not always the case, but most of the time it's the closest to the viewer and it looks a little bit larger. For the background, it's the furthest thing away. So sometimes it gives an idea of where things are taking place, whether you're outside or you're inside, what's the weather like. Lots of clues can be put in the background. Because items in the background are supposed to look farther away, they're usually a lot smaller in size, duller in color, and contain less detail than the objects that are closer to the viewer. So it's a big difference from the foreground with much less detail, and sometimes the color changes. The middle ground is the space naturally occurring between the foreground and the background. Pretty easy. So if you look down at this example, you can see the foreground's in the lower area with that dark bush type shape, the middle ground with that bright green, and the background is the sky. Sometimes you can show space by overlapping things. So if you have something in the foreground overlapping something in the middle ground, it'll help it look like it's in the front. So if we look at these examples down here, of these three images. The first picture, the foreground has animals and land. The middle ground has the building and people in a boat in the water. And the background has the hills. And because those hills are far away, there's less detail and it's basically just sky. The second one below contains the flower in the foreground. We can tell that because it's really large, has lots of detail, and it's lower. It's kind of low on the paper, even though it is in the middle as well. There's one bird on the right that I might consider the foreground. The middle ground has two birds, a nest, and other branches. The background has much less detail, and it almost looks like bushes and the sun shining through. So generally the foreground will have the most detail with small lines and texture, while the background has much less detail and might even look lighter or blurry. Here's what I want you to do for this part of today's activity. You want to plan your scene. Now, ask yourself if you're someone who really needs a graphic organizer. I attached a copy of the graphic organizer that you can print out, cut out, and draw ideas on. So you could actually draw on the area that I labeled foreground with all the things you want to put in your foreground. There's an area that looks like buildings that you could add in for the middle ground. And lastly, what looks like the sky would be background. This picture is actually sideways. So if you cut on the lines and you fold it, you kind of get this kind of scene that will help you. Again, this is optional. So if you need it, it's there, but you do not have to write things out. This is not worth points. It's just to help you. Okay, you're going to make sure you find your watercolor paper. This is the one labeled WC, very small in the corner. And I want you to draw super duper light. Draw your scene extremely light. That way, if you make a mistake, you can erase it. We want to fill the paper with the scene. So think about what's closest to your viewer in the story. Where are you at? That's going to be towards the bottom of the paper in the foreground. What's kind of happening in the middle? Like what's going on? Where are your characters going to be? That's going to be the middle ground. And the background will be things like sky and weather, or if it's inside, it might be what's going out the window, something like that. All right. So start with that and then move on to the next step, which is characters.